Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I want to talk about 10, because it has to be 10, right? You aren't going to click on if it's not 10. I have to say the 10 best something or you won't click on it, right? Of course, these videos give me a chance to talk about music. What my videos are really about is I like to set myself up with a list, do no research, and then just talk about it, see what happens. Because I have spent my life absolutely loving music. It's become my life. It's dictated everything I've ever done. And music's very important to me, and I assume it's very important to you. And it's lovely to talk about music. There's only one thing better than talking about music, and that's listening to music. But talking about music is very important, and talking about music is motivational. Did you know this? That if you hear someone talking about music, it fires up that motivation in you to do things, to go and listen. And when you listen to music, that motivates you to do things. If you're a musician and you want to find the motivation to play, you will find it in music and in people talking about music. So here on this video, I have the 10 greatest debut albums. Now, are they the 10 greatest debut albums? What they are in reality is me thinking about what I think are the 10 greatest debut albums. There's certain albums that I thought of and I thought I don't really like them, and I would be hypocritical to put those on. There's some on here that I'm not, no, I've just looked and I'm a massive fan of all these albums, you know. These albums, these 10 albums, all right, are all, in most cases, amongst the greatest albums made by that artist. And in most cases, I'd say there is perhaps just one or two where it isn't the greatest album they ever made. But in most cases, I would say this album is the greatest album they ever made. And also, the album changed music in some way. Because that's incredible. You imagine being a band and you get signed, or you're an artist and you get signed, and you write your first album. You've never made an album before that's going to be released by a label, ever before. So you write your first album, and that album goes out and it changes music, right? You think about Nirvana. Nirvana did it with Nevermind, but it was their second album. They'd had a little run at it beforehand, right? And I'm sure the Nirvana fans will go, yeah, you know, but Bleach is the best album, blah, 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 it's more authentic, blah, 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 and all that rubbish that, you know, I can't stick, you know. No, the best album's Nevermind, though, which is stupid. Just because it sold a lot of records, you think you're going to make yourself, you know, feel better about yourself by putting you in this sort of elevated, obscure group. You know, you can show off your privilege of knowing more about Nirvana because you know the first album, right? Nah, it just doesn't work on me, mate. So here we have 10 albums that fit those criteria, right? Perhaps their greatest album, definitely one of their greatest album, is a debut album, and it changes the music history in some way. So what have I got? And this isn't in order, I'm not ranking these. All these videos are just, there's just 10 here. I couldn't rank them, it just seems stupid. Right, so at number 10, or the first one, not number 10, could be number anything. They're not ranked. Oh, God, I'm getting confused. So the first one I want to talk about is Dummy by Portishead. I grew up in the early 80s. The early 80s was very exciting for music. We had the new wave of British heavy metal. You had a load of incredible pop music coming out. You had like people like Michael Jackson just setting the bar with incredible pop music there. Over here we had bands like Madness, The Police. The early 80s was great for music, you know. But for me predominantly it was because of the new wave of British heavy metal. By the time we get to the late 80s is just terrible. Absolutely terrible. And it's just all just commercialised sort of yuppie music. It's awful. And then it starts to crack. Everything starts to go. Thrash metal comes out. Grunge comes out. You know, house music comes out. Rap suddenly, you know, with Public Enemy suddenly goes brilliant. Funk metal comes out. Red Hot Chili Peppers, Fishbone. And out of house music, we then get jungle and we get drum and bass. And I felt that was the true revolution at the end of the 80s. Was the sort of electronic dance music, and that label does not describe what's going on. And a whole host of stuff starts to happen after that. And I was very influenced by that. It pulled me back into music, that stuff did. Especially things that was happening in jungle, right? Especially things that were happening in hip-hop. Anyone who knows me knows I'm very interested in English music and the English aesthetic. One night I'm listening to the radio and a track comes on, and it's almost perplexing because this track sounded like a mixture of hip-hop, dance music, jazz, sort of almost like, you know, Shirley Bassey, 60s music, but mixed absolutely terribly, you know. And that track was a song off the debut album by Portishead, off the Dummy album. I can remember it stopping me in my tracks. I looked at the title of the band, Portishead, which comes from Portishead, which is a part of Bristol. I don't know that very well, Bristol, UK. I think it's down by the docks. And I picture that as a sort of, you know, dark, foggy place, perhaps. You know, the English mist rolling into a sort of industrial seascape, you know. And that's what it sounded like. I have a friend, and I won't mention who they are, that was actually working in a studio when Portishead were working on this album, and they asked him to play keyboards. And when he heard the mixes, he said, God, they don't know how to mix, and he didn't get it. And that's surprising because Portishead pulled all these things together and really, on that first album, invent a thing that becomes trip-hop. And trip-hop is still influencing us to this day. A lot of the stuff that's going on the internet, a lot of this lo-fi stuff, a lot of this, all has it has its roots here with Portishead. Of course, there was other bands at the time coming out, like there was Massive Attack, there was Lamb, Tricky, and there was a scene in Bristol where this was all coming out. Massive Attack take a time to get there. Bands like Lamb, their debut album is really incredible, but it's not iconic and classic like Dummy is. And Dummy, for me, sums up how exciting music was in the early 90s. And for me, it's like Dummy is like progressive rock happening all again. It's an English take on American forms, but this time shot through a sort of electronic sampling hip-hop aesthetic. If you don't know the album Dummy, go and check it out. It's absolutely incredible. I was replaced by the drummer Clive Deemer when I played in Robert Plant. He came in the band after me, and I met him a couple of times and talked to him. His contribution on drums in Portishead is absolutely incredible, as was his input into the Ronnie Size group. So this band represents a whole area of music. Ronnie Sides, Goldie, Square Pusher, Aphex Twin. There's a whole thing that going. And this music might not sound the same, but for me, it's all linked together, right? And the great debut, the Portishead were able to nail it on that first album. The album that came out is absolutely great, and it takes the ideas and extends them on. But this album was done. They nailed it on the first album. So that's what I've got as the first album here. Is Dummy by Portishead, right? The next album comes from that period I was just talking about in the mid to late 80s, where music was pretty wretched. And you know what was really wretched? Was rock music. Rock music had sort of devolved into this hair metal sort of, you know, stadium rock, Bon Jovi, you know, thing, which was so far removed from what I'd got into as a metaler, which was Angel Witch and Venom and all that lot. And we had these bands, and they got great players in them, and you were buying albums, you know. And I can remember struggling with Bon Jovi. Great singer, great songs, you know. Richie Sambor, fantastic guitarist, but God, what am I listening to, you know? And then, within that style, within that LA rock style, that sort of West Coast American rock style, Guns N' Roses come out with Appetite for Destruction. And Appetite for Destruction is like the perfect rock album. They never put a foot wrong. There's not a bad song on there. When you put the album on, you're just astonished because you go, oh, is this song on here? Is this song on here? Is this song on here? All the way through, they just blow you away. It's just a magic mix of gutsy rock and roll, incredible guitar playing from Slash, and one of the great vocal performances, from Axl Rose. Wrapped around some absolutely fantastic songwriting. They just nailed it on that album. You know how much they nailed it on that album, that I could quite happily mention Guns N' Roses, and we're quite happy to elevate them up into the rock pantheon of great rock bands. But what else did they really do? You tell me. Their whole reputation rests on that debut album. You can scrap the other albums as far as I'm concerned. I would like to mention a track off Use Your Illusion. These were massive albums and they spent millions of them. And then there is something called the Spaghetti Incident. I don't even know anything about these albums. I can remember some pretty, tortuous MTV videos that obviously cost about 5 million quid with loads of helicopter shots for some of the stuff off. I'm sure they're classic rock songs to certain people, but not to me. They just fell into what everyone else was doing, but not Appetite for Destruction is absolutely credible. I did see them on that tour. In 1988, I saw them at Castle Donington Monster Rock, and it was a terrible show because during their set, I think a couple of people had got crushed to death. I was actually down the front when this was happening. It was quite a shock. So Guns N' Roses have always been linked to me to that gig as well, which was a very strange gig. I'd gone there to see Dave Lee Roth Band with Steve Vai. Guns N' Roses I didn't know that much about. They didn't particularly impress me on that day. Dave Lee Roth's band did. That I don't think I'd actually heard the album by then. But I really believe that Guns N' Roses' legacy is all wrapped up in that album. It's one of the great debut albums. It has to be on the list. So that's who I've got there. That's my second one. So Dummy was my first, and this is my second. Like I said, it's not ranked. Recently, I looked at the sort of Rolling Stone video where we looked at the greatest albums of all time, and I sort of critiqued Rolling Stone's awful top 10 list. And on there, they'd put the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill on there as one of the 10 greatest albums of all time. That's a good album, right? It's a good album. But I mentioned a couple of albums at the time which I thought were much, much better. And one of them was Plantation Lullabies by Michel Ndegocello. Michel Ndegocello is just a rapper, a bass player, a keyboardist, a singer, a composer, but basically she's a poet. She's one of the greatest artists to have emerged for me in the last 30 years. She's done incredible albums, absolutely incredible albums. She's gone deeper into sort of acoustic songwriting, deeper into sort of almost like Coltrane-esque improvisation. She's gone deeper into rap, into soul, into funk and all that stuff. But I feel if you really want to go to that one album that represents what Michel Ndegocello is about, it's that first album, Plantation Lullabies, which is an absolute masterpiece. She sort of does it on that album. I think she was sort of not discovered by Madonna, but I think Madonna set up a label called the Maverick record label. One of the greatest things Madonna did was to sign up Michel Ndegocello. She, for me, is wrapped up in that whole neo-soul scene. People like Jill Scott and Erykah Badu are incredible, and I nearly put Erica's first debut album on as well, which is the same thing. It sort of just represents what she does, and she just nailed it, and it's all there. There was also people like Angie Stone and Maxwell, who are like Michel Ndegocello. It's hard to describe her as a neo-soul artist. She's so much further past that. When we look at the sort of incredible jazz hip-hop albums that emerged in the early 90s, like Brand Nubian, like The Roots, like Diggable Planets. I may do a video on Diggable Planets the other day. I'm listening to that album at the moment, and it's just absolutely incredible. It still sounds as fresh as a daisy to me 30 years later. Michel Ndegocello could be included in all that as well, but she's not that. If we talked about jazz and hip-hop mixed together, she's probably the greatest exponent of that of all time. And all that is on the first album. If you don't know Michel Ndegocello, then go and check out Plantation Lullabies. It's so funky, it's deep. You won't feel like you're listening to hip-hop. You won't feel like she's rapping. You will feel like you're listening to jazz poetry. Some people came on here and said she's not a rapper. It's like jazz poetry. Well, you try and differentiate that. Isn't it the fact that she's just so brilliant at what she's doing? Anyway, that's what I've got. My third choice, Plantation Lullabies by Michel Ndegocello. Right, my next on the list, and this is in no order. It's not in historical order. It's not in a ranking. This is just, I thought, what do I think is the greatest debut albums? And I made a list, and this is what I came up with. And I took a few out, and I had a good big think, and I thought, and I came back to it a few days later and took a few out. This is how I come up with it. Spent a week on this, and this is what we've got. So my fourth choice is the debut album by Van Halen, which is just called Van Halen. Some people call it Van Halen 1. We all know that album. Right, Van Halen don't take any time getting going, you know. They deliver it all on the first album, everything, right? Everything after that's a bonus, right? When the album opens up with "You Really Got Me," that's pointing back to where they come from. "You Really Got Me" by the Kinks is perhaps the first heavy rock track. It's one of the first heavy riffs tracks, I think it's from 1964. So there they're pointing straight back to that. There's no guitar solo there, it's astonishing. It just blows you away by Van Halen's take on rock music, because this is our take on rock music. Oh no, it's not, it doesn't open up with that, it opens up with Running with the Devil, doesn't it? And Running with the Devil's the one without the guitar solo. Running with the Devil does have a guitar solo, but it's like a written guitar solo. But Eruption going into "You Really Got Me," when I first said, because this was the first Van Halen album I ever bought, the first Van Halen track I ever heard was "Ice Cream Man," and I thought it was by Blue Oyster Cult. I actually went out and bought Blue Oyster Cult albums to try and find the track, because I didn't know what it was called. I'd heard taped off the radio, let the tape running, and they didn't say what it was. And at some point they'd mentioned Blue Oyster Cult on this radio show, so I went and bought Secret Treaties, which I didn't like. I listened to this album, Secret Treaties, and I didn't like it. I thought this must be Blue Oyster Cult's worst album, because I hate it. I'd heard Godzilla, and I absolutely loved Godzilla. I never found the album that was on. Of course, there's no internet. How do you find this stuff out? You don't even know the titles. You've got to buy the album and hope the track's on there. But Don't Fear the Reaper I liked, and my mate had that album. I didn't like the rest of the stuff on that album. I'm talking about Blue Oyster Cult here, because I thought the Ice Cream Man was by Blue Oyster Cult, and it just astonished me. Then I heard about Van Halen, bought this album, and was really pleased because it had Ice Cream Man on it. But I can remember putting Running with the Devil on, and Running with the Devil was just a great rock track. I thought this is going to be a good album, really great, really good, really like it. Then Eruption comes out, and on there, it's has any guitarist ever done that in the history of rock music? Ever? Has any guitarist just come out and go, right, a debut album, second track in, it's going to be a guitar solo. You know, Jimmy Page does it in Heartbreaker, doesn't he? On side 2 of their second album, and he does it for about a few minutes. This is a whole track. And anybody listening to it's going, at that time, in 1978, 79, they'd be going, what the hell's going on? You wouldn't even know what he was doing. You would have been wondering whether it was some studio trickery. And then they go into "You Really Got Me." And it was those first 3 tracks by "You Really Got Me." It was the two things. It was the future and the past all woven into together. Eddie Van Halen never goes into jazz fusion. He never goes into prog. He never pushes the boundary of what rock music is about. But within that boundary, he completely reinvents it. And he does it on the first album. You want to know what Van Halen's about? Buy the first album. Yeah, go and get the rest of them, you know. I've got fair warning there behind me. But it's all there on the first album. Everything you need to know. One of the great debuts. That's what I've got at number 4. Right. My 5th choice, I think, has to be Elvis Presley's first album, which is called Elvis Presley. I've spoken about this on my greatest albums of all time. It made my greatest albums of all time. Elvis, without doubt, did everything that he did that was truly great is on that first album. All the revolutionary stuff is on there. When I mentioned this, a lot of people came forward saying, you should have said Little Richard, you should have said Chuck Berry, right? those are the innovators, without a doubt. Fats Domino's an innovator. Those black artists are the innovators, of course. You know, rock and roll is a black music form, and when Chuck Berry decided to mix rhythm and blues, which he knew inside out, with country, with Maybelline, and when Fats Domino does it, you know, when he did that cover of Blueberry Hill, you know, when he does that, there you have rock and roll. It's there. That's rock and roll. But the thing is, rock and roll is important because of its cultural dynamic. It's because it gets picked up by absolutely everybody. Now, is it because of racism that Elvis Presley is a vehicle of that? Of course it is, to some extent. But that takes away also from the fact that Elvis was one of the best looking blokes you've ever seen in your life. That Elvis could move on stage like nobody else. And that Elvis, in his unique position of where he'd been brought up, had access to all these things. That the black music and the country music and gospel and all those things were in his system. And I frankly find it sort of racist to say that only black people have that, white people don't have it, only white people have this, only black people don't have that, which is what in the sense you're saying, all right? I don't see Elvis as a hyper-privileged person, you know, and it's such a shame that when I come to talk about Elvis Presley on this videos, this crops up. I have done a video on identity politics, and you can go and check that out. It's the cultural significance. Yeah, there's racism. I'm not denying the racism that's there. You know, a 1950s mainstream teenage audience, because that's what suddenly happens. We suddenly have teenagers and they want a music form and they want a hero. They want someone they can worship. And Elvis is that. And yes, because of the racism of the time, it has to be a white person, right? But for Elvis to do it, he has to be damn good, and he is, right? And Elvis has things in his voice and the way he delivers, which is absolutely unique to him, and you deny him his talent and his genius, which means you deny everybody their talent and his genius as soon as you start to chop this up, you know. And the terrible racism that existed meant that Elvis Presley had to cut through. And the terrible racism meant that Little Richard, and although they sold millions and they were popular, were not seen in the same light as white artists. And that is the racism. We need to be able to judge Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino as artists in their own right. We need to be able to take that away. Now, as people are going to argue and say, you cannot take that away. I believe there's a choice, and I believe you can. Right? And you can if you stop talking about it and listen to the music. Now, you know, I'm very good friends with a drummer called Bev Bevan, who's a legendary drummer. And if you ask Bev why he did all those things he did, why he learnt the drums, you know, what he was doing in The Move, why this band The Move was revolutionary, how that led on to ELO, everything that he did in ELO, right, goes back to that first Elvis Presley album. Bev's just done an interview with my friend Greg Bendy, and it's an absolutely fascinating interview, which is basically a document of rock history. And he starts with Elvis Presley, and it's that first album. And so many musicians of that era that have created rock music, because rock music itself is a sort of white, and in most cases British take on black Afro-American music forms: blues, rhythm and blues, gospel, jazz. That's what it is. If you deny that, you deny the whole lot of it. Right, so every time I talk about Elvis Presley, I go there. That's what I've got at number, 5 is Elvis Presley. Right, nestling next to Elvis is a band that would probably be spitting out fury of what I've just said. And it's Rage Against the Machine, with their debut album called Rage Against the Machine, which is one of my favourite albums of all time. In the 90s, as we mentioned early on with Portishead and all that stuff that was going on, there was also an incredible rejuvenation of rock and metal. this really down to not just grunge, but also down to thrash metal artists like Anthrax, Metallica and Slayer, Sepultura. It's down to all the funk metal artists like Fishbone, 24/7 Spies, Faith No More, Living Colour. You know, there's just explosion of incredible rock and metal bands in the early 90s. And this coalesced, it starts, by the time you get to the early to mid 90s, it's really coalesced, and rock has had a shot in the arm. And there's a couple of bands that emerge at that point which for me are absolutely brilliant. One of them's Pantera and the other one's Rage Against the Machine. But Rage Against the Machine just sort of coalesce everything that's going on: grunge, funk metal, rap metal, thrash metal, you know, Soundgarden, all that type of stuff. They managed to coalesce it all on that first album and go beyond it. I love the energy. I love the commitment to what they're saying, right? I love the anger. I love the reaction. We need that. We need, you know, I'm sure, you know, the guys of Rage Against the Machine would be spitting hellfire at me, you know, playing down, you know, or arguing up Elvis's contribution. To me, it seems absolutely imperative that Elvis Presley, that we maintain some respect for his actual individual brilliance while accepting the racism of the time. I feel I need to do that, but I also feel there's a need for artists to go out and shout that stuff. You know, one of my favourite bands of all time, and I'm listening to them at the moment deeply, is Public Enemy. And it's like an education. And Rage Against the Machine are coming out of that legacy of hip-hop as well, and doing it absolutely brilliantly. It's not rap metal as some sort of novelty. They mean it. And the other thing that would much be mentioned with Rage Against the Machine is Tom Morello's incredible guitar playing, where he takes the idea of a guitar hero and again shoots it through hip-hop and thinks of the transformative properties of the hip-hop scratch DJ, and tries to do that in guitar. Not just tries to do it, he pulls it off. He pulls it off. He's one of the great guitar players. They're an absolutely fantastic band. I just love the commitment, energy. I love the riffs. I love the production. It's all on that first album. They did a couple of albums after that, I think. I got... is it Evil Empire? Is that the second album? It's a really good album. But for me, it does not go beyond the first album. And then I lost track for them. I don't need any of the albums. All I need is the first Rage Against the Machine album. That does it for me. You know, here we are how many years later? 27, 28 years later from the release of that album. And I'm in there with a bunch of 16-year-olds just coming to college. And what tune do they choose to do to, you know... broadcast their existence in the music world in this new college, and it's killing in the name of. I used to be in a band in the early 90s, and we used to play at venues, in a venue in Dudley. There used to be a rock night on Saturday night at a venue called JB's. It's a really legendary venue where I live, and we used to play a Saturday night in there. And we were a rock band, and we thought we were pretty cool. And I don't know if the DJ did it on purpose, but just before we were about to go on stage, he would put "Killing in the Name of," and the audience would be destroyed. It would just drive them nuts, and they would just kill themselves. They would like be wrecked. You know, they would go so mad that by the time we came on stage, there was nothing left. I'm sure he did it on purpose, but that's the power of Rage Against the Machine. Right, I ain't going to talk about the next one on the list, but it has to go on the list. So at number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, my 7th choice, this is not ranked, is In a Mountain Flame by the Mahavishnu Orchestra. You know, doing this channel, I've changed my opinion about that album. This channel is here because of a ranking video I did a couple of years ago now. I ranked the Mahavishnu Orchestra albums, and I put Birds of Fire at number 1. That's my favourite. That was the one I grew up with. It had the Moog on there, the double bass drumming, the production. What they did on In a Mountain Flame, they'd taken beyond that, you know. But doing this channel and reading the comments of people on here, because so many people came on and said, no, it's In a Mountain Flame, you know, that's almost like it's like the punk rock of jazz fusion, right? People love the rawness, they love the out of controlness about it, okay? And I accept that. But one of the things I've realised about this album is that when that album comes out, that defines jazz fusion. As simple as that. Before then, it's an idea, and musicians are trying to use it. You know, they're trying to do it. Would it even have become a thing if the Mahavishnu Orchestra hadn't come along and coalesced it and sold a ton of records? You know, I think Miles had done something with Bitches Brood. He'd sold 500,000 albums, so the record companies said, "Oh, this is really interesting. Can we make some money out?" This is why they signed up Weather Report and put a ton of money into them, doing quite esoteric, you know, sort of electric jazz. But I would describe that as electric jazz. I don't think Bitches Brew is a fusion album. Fusion is a certain thing. It's like machine gun drumming, you know, intense guitar playing that's coming out of Jimi Hendrix, odd time signatures, virtuosity. It's brutal and exciting. It's got progressive rock elements in it. That's what jazz rock is. And that's what I mean by jazz rock fusion. And later on, fusion becomes a word to describe crossover music, and I shouldn't really use the term. I do actually prefer the term jazz rock, which is, I think, you know, delineates a classic period of music, and that is ushered in by the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And without this album, I just don't think it would exist. I don't think we would have had it. And the success of that album changed musicians like Chick Corea. It changed musicians like Joe Zawinul, and they changed direction. Even Herbie Hancock, turning away from that electric jazz sound that Miles had done towards Headhunters and all that. So I'm sure, and the influence on bands like Yes, the influence on bands like Led Zeppelin, the influence on bands like Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa's music just changes with this album. And this album, for anyone who's ever heard it, is a shock. Someone on my channel who had never heard it put it on the other day, and they said it's just too noisy, it's not emotional, it's just noise, it's too out of control. Yeah, that's what you're dealing with this album, without a doubt. So the next one I've got on a list is an album I've put down elsewhere, and it's In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. When I ranked my 10 favourite King Crimson albums, it didn't make the list. It's not because I hate the album, it's because it's probably my 11th favourite King Crimson album. And I've always taken that stance. It's not a perfect album for me, right? And it's the one on this list where I do think King Crimson many times over have outdone that album, right? But I think it needs to be on this list because I just think that on that album they invent progressive rock. You know, now people are going to argue with that. They're going to mention the Moody Blues. They're going to mention the Nice, right? They may mention Pink Floyd, right? But what I think we know as progressive rock, and to some extent aspects of heavy metal, and to some extent aspects of jazz fusion, is all absolutely, the groundwork is laid on that King Crimson album. I was watching a video interview with Robert Fripp the other day, and someone asked him about Jimi Hendrix, and he said, I want to tell you, I'll tell you my Hendrix story. And it was basically Hendrix that came to see them play, and they met up afterwards, they had a chat, and then many years later he hooked at someone that had been at the same gig, sat next to Hendrix, and Hendrix was watching King Crimson, and he turned around to that person and said, "This is the greatest band in the world." And I think in 1969 they probably were. They do take a few wrong turnings on that album for me. But if we forgive of that and look at the power, right, the importance of this album in terms of the history of progressive rock is absolutely undeniable. I have always felt that is really... My phone's just gone off there. I've always felt that that's really all coalesced within 21st Century Schizoid Man, which is the first track on the album. And I think that's probably why it's here, because can you imagine an album of this greatness with that as the first track? That is possibly the greatest debut ever. My students that know nothing about this music, I played them 21st Century Schizoid Man, which is 50 years old now. It's over 50 years old. and still it has the power to shock. It's an incredible debut. That is probably the most incredible debut on any debut album. So that's what I've got there. Right, the next album on the list is Grace by Jeff Buckley. I missed out on Jeff Buckley. I can remember when he died, reading an obituary about him and I thought, I don't sound like the sound of this guy. Sounded like a more songwritery. He was Tim Buckley's son. I didn't get Tim Buckley. I'd heard him and I didn't really get that at all, what Tim Buckley was doing, and that was my fault. I have then come to appreciate Tim Buckley greatly. And so I didn't know anything about Jeff Buckley in 97 when he died. In 1998, I then hooked up with Robert Plant, and we formed a band called Priory Brian. And I went over to Robert's. Now, this is a testament to Jeff Buckley. This is where the story comes from. And we were just talking about the band and what we wanted to do, and we were talking about, really great music. And Robert goes off and he pulls Jeff Buckley's debut album out, Grace, and he puts it on, and I've never heard it. And this is Robert Plant going, this is really, really great. And when that happens, you sit up and listen, but you also know that, Robert's interests in music are different to mine. So this could well be some sort of Americana acoustic thing that I don't quite get because I'm a jazz guy. And this thing was always going on with me, when I was in that band with Robert, that my influences were different. And some of the stuff I loved, Robert didn't love as much, shall we say. And there was lots of discussion. So this is preempting that. And that's the circumstances. I'm in Robert's house. He's got his incredible stereo. It sounds incredible. And he puts on Grace by Jeff Buckley. And I am instantly astonished by this album. My daughter is named after this album, and my dog is named after Mojo. My dog Mojo, who hasn't been on the channel yet, and we must get on at some point. This would be the right time for him to come on. I ain't going to go and get him. But my dog Mojo is named after this album. That's the impression that this album made. What Jeff Buckley did on that album, and then he did a few demos, and there's another album that comes out, but it's basically just pulled together. There's some really great stuff on there, but it's really pulled together. This is his legacy, that one album, and it is truly astonishing. As a music teacher, when my students first come in, I often play them this album, and I usually play them the track Grace, and it has the power to astonish. Recently, Kate Bush became, amongst young people, Kate Bush suddenly became Flavour of the Month because she was in that Stranger Things, or whatever it's called. Was it Stranger Days? I can't even remember. I'm getting too old to even remember anything to do with youth culture now. It's one of those two things. And I went to college, and all my 16, 17-year-old students are sat there, and they are saying, do you like Kate Bush? I go, yeah, I like Kate Bush. Have you got any of her albums? Yes, I've got all her albums. She's really good, isn't she? Yes, she's really, really good. She's been really good for like about 37 years. She's really, really good, whatever. In that sort of tiresome old man way. And I turned around them and I said, there's loads of artists. It's such a shame that either a song has to be on TikTok or in some, TV show for you to appreciate them. I said, but as soon as it is, it's incredible when you are playing incredible music that you absolutely love it. And this one kid goes, well, play us something we don't know, Andy. Then play us something that's really, really good. And I said, all right, then I'm going to play you a track by an artist called Jeff Buckley. I'm going to play you a track off the album Grace, and it's called Grace. And I put it on. And the astonishment that went through the room. And the next day I walked in, and those kids went, I've been listening to that album by Jeff Buckley. It's unbelievable. And then this one kid goes, yeah, he's better than Freddie Mercury. Yeah, that's how good Jeff Buckley is. He may well have been better than Freddie Mercury. Shall we leave it at that? Absolutely incredible album. If you don't know it, go and listen to it. It's an album that I think it doesn't matter what music you like, you're going to be blown away by that album. It's worth mentioning that he came up as a jazz fusion guitarist. He was Alan Holdsworth fan. He was Al Di Meola fan. He went to GIT, he did like weather report covers, it's all there for you to find out. And he originally was a guitarist that wanted to work as a guitarist. He could have well become a jazz fusion guitarist, you know. But he used to sing, he was a bit embarrassed about his voice, he used to sing. Also remember, he's Tim Buckley's son, and Tim Buckley's another artist that I came through from Robert Plant. We used to do Song of the Siren when I was in the band with him, so I checked him out. Then I realised that Tim Buckley he comes out of that American folk rock scene in the 60s, but he almost creates his own type of jazz fusion. He really does. And on Star Sailor, I think that's the name of the album. I'm not a Tim Buckley expert, but on there is the track Song of the Siren, but there's also some really incredible improvisation. It's his own version of jazz fusion. The guy was a genius. Of course, you know, Jeff never really met Tim. They weren't, you know, but there's a legacy that goes through, and I think Jeff had to fight that. He had to fight against that. He was a troubled person. Absolute disaster that this guy died, because he would have been a force of nature, I think. He really would. Anyway, that's my second to last album. So the last album I came, and I think if I was, and this is probably going to go on for a while now, this talk now, because I haven't talked about this, well, I have a little bit. I've talked about this band a little bit on the channel. But this band, you could say, is almost like an anathema to everything this channel represents, but I don't think they do. I think this could well be the greatest debut album of all time. And if I was ranking this would be at number 1. And it's Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols. I am a product of punk. In 1977, when punk happened, I was 9 years old. I really just started listening to music. I was listening to music in the charts. My dad saw the Sex Pistols, and at that moment in 1977, he switched off the television. We weren't allowed to watch. My dad, who was a big jazz fan, you know, and he was into the modern jazz called Dave Brubeck. He didn't like the Sex Pistols, and he switched the television off at that point. We didn't watch Top of the Pops. I missed out on this totally. What would have happened if I'd have heard it? I may have been one of those kids that rather than going down the route I went, I would have gone down the route that all my friends did, which was to form punk bands. You know, just up the road from me, you know, 5 miles up the road, is a ton of bands that were formed. All those guys in those bands are my age. There's 3 bands. There's the Wonder Stuff, they're a little bit older than me, and then Pop Will Eat Itself and Ned's Atomic Dustbin. I know some of the guys out of those bands. In fact, John Penny, who's the lead singer of Ned's Atomic Dustbin, is one of my best friends. I absolutely love the guy, and I get on with him because he is the complete anathema to me. I'm all prog and jazz and, you know, virtuosity, and he is an economic, punk-influenced, growing up in an indie period in England, and putting all those influences together into Ned's Atomic Dustbin. And those bands had huge success. I had a whole, you know, bunch of people in my generation that, you know, towards the end of the 80s were in the same pubs at me. They had their little bands doing the same gigs, and those bands went on to sell millions of records, you know. And at some point I will deal with that. I'm friends with some of the guys from EMF. I'm friends with some of the guys from Pop Will Eat Itself. And like I say, one of my best friends is John Penny from the Neds. And I will deal with that in that channel. And what that is the legacy of punk rock. Punk rock was just so important, right? So my daughter keeps opening the door and trying to get me to stop doing these videos. They always do. This is a Saturday, and I'm spending my Saturday doing these videos for you. I hope you appreciate this. So I'll have to I'll get through this. She's put me off doing this. I tell her not to do it. She knows, right? That's true punk there. You know, if she really had the punk attitude, she would be in here tearing this down, knocking the camera down, right? Punk has a lineage. You know, the punk that comes through Iggy Pop and Patti Smith and all that type of punk, that's very college kids punk. What Britain did was bring this working class thing in. There's a whole bunch of incredible bands around that time, Stranglers, The Damned, The Clash. But the Sex Pistols, for me, go beyond that. They have this sheen of almost being like a product, but we know they're not. They are just entirely not a product. They're beyond any other punk band. All those punk bands, they're beyond that, because they have a trueness about them and a charlatanness about them. That's all summed up with John Lydon's comment when he first played in New York, and he said, you know, do you ever feel like you've been cheated? The Sex Pistols have all of that, right? And it's all nailed on this first album. And this first album changes music. I've argued elsewhere, and you can go and search it out, that I feel that punk was not the antithesis of prog. It was actually grows out of prog. It's a reaction against prog. But there is enough of prog's DNA for you to see it as being in the line of prog, right? That homemade English aesthetic, that want to push the boundaries, that turning against sort of black music forms, the English literature, all sort of references, all that stuff is still in punk, right? Those musicians have grown up listening to punk. Now, yeah, they are, you know, if you're John Lydon, you're taking selectively. You're taking from Captain Beefheart. You're taking from David Bowie. You're taking from Peter Hamill and Van der Graaf Generator. But it's in there. John Lydon's voice is just very indebted to Peter Hamill, right? And I think when punk happens, which is a very short period of time, all those progressive tendencies, they get channeled in a different way. And so a lot of the new wave bands and a lot of the sort of indie bands, a lot of the sort of new romantic bands that then emerge in Britain in the popular music scene, prog is in their DNA. It's prog and punk mixed together. This is the great album that freshens all that up. It's an absolutely monumental album. Punk, I am, like I said, I am of that generation. I am a product of punk. I have the punk attitude in my mind. I completely understand it. It's the dot in my yin to punk's yang. If I do sit down with someone like John Penny from Ned's Atomic Dust, I mean, we chat, I love the fact that he distrusts the virtuosity that's in a lot of the music I like. And I think when you're dealing with progressiveness, when you're trying to extend boundaries, when you're trying to make the music bigger and more complex and push it out, if you're trying to use virtuosity, you do that at your peril. I get very annoyed with the the modern take on progressive music and jazz fusion. The way it gets belittled as being pretentious and overblown, that there's no emotion in it. I get very annoyed with that. But by the same token, if you are going to make instrumental music or progressive music or jazz fusion, you need a pinch of punk in there. You need something to keep you out on the straight and narrow, because you can be pretentious and you can be overblown and you can be self-indulgent. When many years later Bill Laswell produced a Public Image Limited album called Album, which is one of the great albums of the 1980s in my opinion, and he pulled a whole host of different musicians on that album. You've got Steve Vai on there, Ginger Baker, Tony Williams, Jonas Hellborg, Zakir Hussain, and it shows how closely linked the punk aesthetic is with jazz fusion and progressive rock. It's on that album called Album. But they also pulled Miles Davis in on that album as well, and those tracks never saw the light of day. Isn't that punk? You pull Miles Davis in your album, then you choose not to put those tracks out. Incredible. But when Miles Davis heard John Lydon, he turned around and he goes, "That guy sings like I play the trumpet." And that is totally true. It's totally true. So yeah, that's what I've got here. I'm going to go through them again. So these are my 10 greatest debut albums. I'm sure people will have their own versions of it. Please be aware this is my version of it. It's not my favourite ones. It is my opinion on what the 10 best are, but it is only my opinion. Please remember that. You know, I don't want to have to rant about biscuits for like half an hour to prove the point to you all again, but I will do. I will do. We've got Dummy by Portishead, Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses, Plantation Lullabies by Michelle Ndegocello. We've got Van Halen's debut album called Van Halen, Elvis Presley's self-titled debut album, Rage Against the Machine with their self-titled debut album, In a Mountain Flame by the Mahavishnu Orchestra. We've got In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson, Grace by Jeff Buckley, and Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols. And if you took the best track off each of those albums, wouldn't that be an incredible compilation album? I think it would. Anyway, I've come to the end of this video. I hope you liked it. I hope you appreciated it. I'm now doing these longer videos where I just let myself talk. And at the end of every video, there's always a special feature where I just go and talk about anything random. This is a new thing that I'm going to do. On the last video, I just looked at the first thing and I saw a box of Battenberg cakes on the floor. And I'm not going to do that in this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out an album from behind me and I'm going to talk about it in relation to what we've just been talking about. Because I think the reason why people like this channel, because they know I am living on the seat of my pants. Right? So let's live on the seat of my pants. I am not looking. I'm keeping my eyes on you and I'm grabbing an album out of here. What have we got? Is fate going to be kind to me so I can link it to at least one of the artists on here? Oh, too easy. Too easy. What do we have here? We have Marathon by Santana. Not one of their best albums, actually. But pretty good. I think when I did my top 10 Santana albums, I never mentioned this album. You know, just opened it up. Here it is. Just having a look. I'm trying to reacquaint myself a little bit with this. It's I think this is, I would guess this is 78 or 9. So it's Santana are the great sort of Latin rock band. It's their own genre of this sort of blues rock, but it's got a Latin tinge to it. They do Woodstock, they become, you know, massive, multi-million selling band. And then they throw a curveball in because they discover like Miles Davis and Coltrane, and they do this run of fusion albums that sell millions but are really heavy, but actually aren't that successful. They don't deliver on what they did with the first 3 albums. They pull up all that together on an album called Amigos, which is my favourite Santana album. And after that, there's a run of albums. Moonflower, which is half live, half studio, which I absolutely love. There is Inner Secrets, which is okay. And then there's this one. And it's all diminishing returns with this one. It's like, if disco's come along. Now, I think disco is to jazz fusion what punk is to prog. It's like and if you really want to know what the polar opposite is of prog, it's disco. And if you really want to know what the polar opposite of jazz fusion is, it is punk, without a doubt. And those two genres are all there, and it's all happening around about 1978, 77, 78, 76. Here we have an album from 79, and Santana is really under the spell of disco, and record companies have changed their agendas. They know they're not going to make their money out of fusion. Everyone's trying to sell hit records and stuff, all that. I think the hit single off this, was it All I Ever Wanted? I don't know. This is the diminishment of fusion here. This is what happened, and it's not a bad album. It's a pretty good album. Of course, who is it linked to? Well, we directly linked to In a Mountain Flame, Mahavishnu Orchestra, because there's that link there with all of that. You know, I can't really see any link anywhere else. I'm trying to rack my brains here. It would be lovely if I could come up with some real obvious link. I think who we got on drums on this, is it Graham Lear? Graham Lear, of course, he was also did some incredible drumming for Gino Vanelli. I'm having a look. I'm just checking. It is. Yeah, it's Graham Lear on drums. We've got, as I said, played with Gino Vanelli. Gino Vanelli also used some really incredible drummers. on his albums, including on Nightwalker Vinnie Colaiuta, who I think is one of the great drummers of all time. Vinnie's played on hundreds and hundreds of albums. He's played with John McLaughlin. He's played on a tribute album to Van Halen, which I have actually got. So there's a Van Halen connection there. It's going to be hard for me. I'd love to be able to try, using my knowledge, to just go through this list and try and link Vinnie, to try and link this Santana album through Graham Lear, through Gino Vanelli, through Vinnie. But the one to be really brilliant would be to link it through to the Sex Pistols, which I think I've now done, because I'm sure Vinnie has played with many of the musicians off that album. But of course his great mentor drum-wise was Tony Williams. And Tony Williams, of course, played on album by John Lydon, and John Lydon's the singer on Never Mind the Bollocks. So I have been able to link this album to quite a few of the artists on there. That's quite... I love playing that game. I've never played that game actually live in front of the camera before, but yeah, you must be sick now. I'm down to you four. I can't even count. I'm down to you four now, aren't I? I'm down to you four. You know, the four that are left at the end watching, that get to the end of the video when I've really gone on. This is a new thing here. So if you have got to the end, tell me your favourite Santana album. And then everybody who's only watched the first part will think, what the hell's going on? See you on the next video. Thanks for watching.